fortunate to have introduced the panel tonight, a former member of our Board of Trustees for 8 years, and half of that time he was chairman of our board, a former president of the A.S. Abel Company, Mr. Donald Patterson. Mr. Patterson.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know why they've asked me to welcome you. I would suspect that most of you, if not all, know these gentlemen as well, if not better than I do. After 14 years, at least for Mr. Sterne and Mr. Corddry, the term of 14 years probably seems like nothing. Mr. Matthews has only been here half that time, so I'm told. As a matter of fact, nobody could tell me exactly how long he's been coming here. Nevertheless, it's a pleasure to introduce them. I'm going to surprise you by not going into any lengthy dissertations about anything except something that seemed to me just an amazing coincidence. A week ago, January the 7th, it was a rather comprehensive editorial on the things that were confronting Mr. Clinton when he went to Europe, and that was followed by the cartoon today in which the rather strong emphasis was placed by the cartoonist on the fact that the news media was supposed to overlook the government to make sure that they stayed in line. The bottom half of that cartoon said, who's going to look at the news media to keep them in line? Good point. I emphasize that because I think that I know personally Mr. Sterne and Mr. Corddry fit that perfectly. And I would be sure of, I don't think I'd find any argument about the third member being equally as careful about what he does or doesn't do in gathering news. For instance, say 10 years ago, I went to Washington for one of these highfalutin get-togethers that the news media give, where all the politicians and all the big shots are assembled. And I was accosted by a general, United States Army general, who said that he wanted me to know personally that he held Mr. Corddry in highest esteem. He said, we know that we can give background information to Mr. Corddry, and it will be used exactly for that reason, just background, that he would know where the Pentagon was going and why. But he would never divulge the source, he would never go into the details. That's what's called reliable, conscientious journalism. And something that I think, I shouldn't be talking like this is your time, but anyhow, I think that the news media has to be even more conscientious about maintaining a proper attitude toward their news gathering. And I think that the news media I'm talking about, the newspapers, at this time are the only source of news and information for the citizens of the United States that is not corrupted by this technology, which has run TV into a totally irrational and I think sometimes dangerous attitude about news coverage. I've said enough now. Ladies and gentlemen.
We'll try to follow the usual format. I'll go last, Mark will go next, and then Charlie after him. I just want to say one thing, that when we had our first panel 14 years ago or so, we were trying to anticipate the foreign policy of a brand new president who was about to be inaugurated. His name was Ronald Reagan. So this will give you an idea how much territory we've been covering over these many years. I just hope there are no transcripts of our earlier comments, so we won't have to back them up. Okay, Mark, it's all yours.
Good afternoon. I've been trying to cover the Clinton foreign policy for a year, and am still sorting out a great number of things, but there are some preliminary conclusions I think that can be reached. One is, I think it's a myth that Bill Clinton isn't interested in foreign affairs. From what we've been able to see so far, there doesn't seem to be a single subject that he isn't interested in. He's a bit like Hubert Humphrey in that respect, and he gets deeply involved in the nitty-gritty of foreign policy problems. But and the reason why there hasn't been perhaps as much public emphasis on foreign affairs is the simple one that he won a campaign against a president who seemed to be absorbed in foreign policy practically to the exclusion of everything else. And the White House keeps that political knowledge uppermost in its mind. But I think interest in foreign affairs is far different from being good at it. And in the past year, we've got a very clear sense of just what it is that Clinton is good at and what he isn't good at. He's assigned his top priority to two areas. One, Russia. The success of Boris Yeltsin and the evolution of democratic and market reforms in Russia. This was urged on him over the campaign and subsequently by his old friend Strobe Talbot, who is about the strongest and most influential voice inside the administration. In fact, he seems to be one of a very small handful of top officials who has deep convictions and is prepared to really pound the table in seeing that the president carries them out. The other top priority that Joe will get into at much more length is what Warren Christopher calls economic security. Bill Clinton has a vision of expanding markets and expanding free trade that he hopes will generate jobs and future prosperity. And from that, I think will flow some potentially troubling national security consequences, because if you're going to expand your economic ties abroad, almost inevitably you are going to expand what you consider to be your vital interests. It's been said that someone just told me last week that the British East India Company at one time had the largest standing army in the world. And that's an indication of how threat of force, and occasionally conflict follow economic interests. And at the same time that President Clinton is expanding American economic interests, we see something of a contraction in the scope of American, I won't say military force, but the whole combination of military and diplomatic and political pressure and influence in the world that I do not believe is going to be compensated for by events such as this week, when President Clinton is attempting to chart a new direction for NATO. In the past year, we've seen how President Clinton handled some of the problems that he inherited, and the results have basically been to move from one problem to the next, leaving none of them quite solved. They complain, and Warren Christopher's complained about this publicly, that Bosnia, Somalia, and Haiti were inherited problems. Compared to what some past presidents inherited, these don't show themselves to be all that serious. They in no way compare with an ongoing confrontation with the Soviet Union. They don't compare with a growing Soviet presence in Cuba, with the Berlin crisis, such as John F. Kennedy inherited, or with the Vietnam War. They were serious, knotty problems that were going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible to solve, but had the potential for being managed. And what each of these episodes has shown about Clinton is a lack of confidence and a lack of experience, which combine show an absence of instinct in how to get what he wants and assert American power. With Bosnia, the low point came when Secretary Christopher was dispatched to Europe in an effort to line up European support for Clinton's effort to intervene militarily, which was the so-called lift and strike plan, lifting the arms embargo on the Bosnian Muslims and launching compensatory airstrikes against Serb positions. The Europeans made clear before Secretary Christopher went on the trip that they were opposed to it, and nothing that he said while he was over there changed their mind. Nevertheless, he came back with the conviction that if Clinton stood up to the plate, as one of his aides told me, the Europeans would reluctantly fall in line. Instead, what happened was, at a very crucial moment, Clinton decided not to go ahead. One of the factors was that he got a cable from Moscow, where Strobe Talbot had just been meeting with the Russian government, warning that Russia could well veto this in the Security Council, and also warning that it would put Boris Yeltsin in a very weak position. Clinton sided with Talbot. This was one factor among several, but it shows Talbot's influence, and decided not to press ahead with a lift and strike proposal. Subsequently, and that has been a festering sore ever since, and what was decided yesterday by NATO does not appear to be decisive enough to change the situation. Subsequently, Clinton got embroiled more deeply than he expected in Somalia through perhaps a bit of inattention and some very strong pressure from within the administration, particularly from Madeleine Albright, the UN ambassador. The administration accepted and went along with the United Nations, Boutros Ghali's plan for nation building in Somalia, an attempt to turn what had been just a humanitarian effort into a political effort that would leave Somalia in much better shape than the United Nations had found it. I believe that they kind of got sucked into that without paying strong attention to the consequences, and dispatched forces to undertake a rather risky disarming effort without either the military or the political support to accomplish it fully, and certainly without any advanced preparation of the American people and Congress, which, as has been shown many times, is vital for a military undertaking. The result, as we all remember, was that when Rangers were ambushed and killed, and when one was held hostage, the situation turned around completely, and Clinton altered his policy and announced a withdrawal this coming spring. As if that wasn't bad enough, almost in the same news cycle that the administration changed its course on Somalia, they also reversed course on Haiti, withdrawing a ship carrying armed American monitors and trainers that was just about to land in Port-au-Prince. It was, the provocation was an unruly mob on the docks at Port-au-Prince. Neither of these things is terribly important in itself. In combination, they're worse, but more important is that they send a signal that American purpose can be very quickly compromised without all that much trouble. Mohammed Farah ID doesn't even rise to the level of a typical African dictator. He, in fact, doesn't control a country. He controls a portion of Mogadishu. Raul Cedras is the military leader of Haiti, but is not a recognized figure, recognized diplomatically or recognized by much of his combination. I believe that abroad a message was sent and in fact was received, and one place that it was received was in North Korea. At about this time last year, the North Korean regime, which has always been, has for the past 4 decades been isolated, Stalinist, and backward, but nevertheless is quite shrewd politically and diplomatically, blocked the international nuclear inspectors from their attempt to get to the bottom of its suspected nuclear supply or nuclear arsenal, depending on whether the CIA is correct that it actually has bombs. The IAEA used to be a completely toothless organization, but the Persian Gulf War and the subsequent discovery that Saddam Hussein was well on his way to toward getting a nuclear bomb embarrassed it into a much tougher stance, and North Korea was its first opportunity to assert itself. North Korea rejected the idea of a special or challenge inspection. Instead of just inspecting a series of sites that North Korea had been willing to disclose and have inspected, the IAEA wanted to pounce on 2 sites where it believed the North Koreans were storing nuclear waste. North Korea refused, the IAEA persisted, and the United Nations Security Council backed it up with a resolution, whereupon North Korea said, fine, we're going to pull out of the non-proliferation treaty, which means you won't be able to inspect anything at all. The American response to that was a diplomatic effort to try to get North Korea back into the treaty, back into the non-proliferation treaty. And they concentrated all their energies toward this end. As of now, North Korea is sort of half in, half out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Basically, it's got one foot in, but it says we're in limbo, and as long as we're in limbo, we're still going to object to your trying to find everything that you're looking for. Nevertheless, this has been portrayed as something of an achievement by the Clinton administration. Where this will lead is uncertain, but it looks as though the Clinton administration is having trouble coming to grips with one of the key realities that it faces in the post-Cold War period. There is no longer a need for containment of a Soviet threat, but there is a need. It's growing increasingly clear for a policy of containment generally, and it's one of containment of the bad guys. And the United States has a number of ways that it can do this, and a robust military posture is only one of them. If that is combined with a strong reputation for purpose and determination, that reputation can act in a way as a kind of what Charlie might call a force multiplier, with the result that you don't have to use military force all that often. The bottom line right now appears to be that the Clinton administration doesn't have very many bottom lines, and it'll be interesting to see if one is forced upon them through a treaty obligation or some other an engagement of vital interest where President Clinton will simply be told one day that he has no choice but to assert American power. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, good to see you all again. And I must say at the outset, Don, thank you very much for your kind remarks before the multitudes here. I'm very grateful to you indeed, sir. Mark said he was going to leave NATO to me tonight, and his reason was that I'd covered it a long time. And this reminds me, and I'll bore you, that the first time I ever met General Shalikashvili, who is the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the question of when I started covering NATO came up. He was at that time the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and some reporter said when Eisenhower was there. And I took no exception to that because it was the truth. And so I've had a long acquaintance with NATO, but it ended this week because I don't know where it's going now. I haven't the faintest idea, but I'd like to say, I'd like to begin my remarks with a couple of anecdotes. I was in Brussels in 1992 at about this time, and an official of NATO there told me what I believed to be what was going on, had been going on for 2 or 3 years, and is still going on, and that is that as the Soviet Union collapsed, at that point the Warsaw Pact, of course, had collapsed earlier on, the countries in Eastern Europe looked around and saw who was having the best of it in the world and rang up Manfred Werner, who was the Secretary General of NATO, and said, we want to come in. And that has been on their minds ever since. So that you have seen this week suggestion of a partnership for peace that would run, for gosh sake, to Tajikistan, which is on the border of Afghanistan, and that's a pretty big North Atlantic treaty area. The other anecdote is at a meeting in Munich, and on the same trip, a large group of American big wheels were threshing around the idea of how far down we could draw our forces in Europe now that the Cold War was over. And a four-star general got up and said he hadn't intended to speak that evening, but he wanted to remind these people that if they expected to have a key to the men's room, they'd better stick around. And at that point, the argument was whether we should have 150,000 troops in Europe. And now President Clinton is very firmly asserting we won't go below 100,000. I have no idea whether that's enough, but it gives you a clue to what's going on, which I will mention again in just a moment. But in regard to the desire of the East European countries and perhaps others of the former Soviet Union to get into NATO, the president sold a rather murky thing called a Partnership for Peace, and at least the countries of NATO signed on, and it will, I should think, be years before we know what this amounts to. What is involved here is an extension of geographic boundaries of a military alliance that is rapidly taking down its defenses. And the possibility exists, and I think it's almost a fait accompli, that the United States and its allies are taking on a new commitment to the defense of Eastern European countries, which is to be worked out individually and so on, but nonetheless the fat's in the fire, without the slightest bit of public debate. And so I think we've not heard the end of that. And the other point that flows from my two anecdotes, of course, is that if we are taking on a new commitment, if the military alliance is going to be expanded some hundreds of miles to the east, but not so much or so fast that it would worry the Russians, why are we demobilizing so much of our military power? Now, Senator Sam Nunn shut down the proceedings in the Senate after the last budget sessions by pointing out that what we were doing was taking on more jobs and cutting back the forces, and that we're either going to have to increase the money or we're going to have to rearrange our commitments and forces. And so I think that this is an issue that the Clinton administration did not come to Washington expecting to have to fool with very much, but that it shortly will. It's not just NATO week, but since we were here a year ago, a few other things have happened, and it's become plainer than ever that there are multiple, what the military call threats, what others might call problems, but I'm not entirely sure that they're opportunities, but they're out there. And Jim Woolsey, the director of Central Intelligence, says we got rid of the dinosaur and now we've got a garden full of snakes. And this is the truth. Anywhere you look, you've got religious, ethnic, regional conflict potential, proliferation of nuclear weapons. If we let North Korea get away with this, what is it going to do for all the other ambitious countries? And if we keep saying we won't let her get Pyongyang do this, but we don't do anything about it, what does that say? And so I think proliferation of nuclear weapons is very much to the front, and the proliferation of the missiles that could carry them, well, North Korea is a producer, China is a producer, Syria, Libya, Iran, Iraq are among the recipients. so that it isn't all that peaceful a world in which we are trying to make our way. And I should like to say, by the way, that I think that decent and honorable men are doing their best, and that it's maybe a lot easier for us to sit here and tear down or find fault with what they do. But nonetheless, that is a part of the job that we in our business have. I want to touch just very quickly on the military, purely military side of things. The Clinton administration, I don't challenge Mark that Bill Clinton's interested in foreign affairs. I don't challenge that he's like Hubert Humphrey, was interested in everything. But I do think that they came to Washington expecting to dwell on domestic affairs, and now and again some foreign thing got in the way. At a subway. So what they did on defense was, as some might say, ready, fire, aim. In March, they cut the budget, and in September, they concluded their studies on what we needed in defense, which is a little bit topsy-turvy. And the studies came out a few $1 billion short. This was called a bottom-up review, which concluded that we needed to have a force that was capable of waging 2 wars almost simultaneously, because the threats seemed to center in something the size of the Iraqi force and possibly on the Korean Peninsula. Those would be the direst circumstances. I think, frankly, that they, under Les Aspin and Colin Powell, put together a force that could probably have a good chance of doing that if it were financed. But I don't for one moment any longer think that it's going to be financed at the levels which would be required. And I'll only tantalize and tease you, but not tell you the answer, and that is much, because I don't know, much will depend on how the new Secretary of Defense, Bobby Ray Inman, handles his relations with the Office of Management and Budget and the White House. And all we know really about Bobby so far is he told us on the lawn of the White House that he'd interviewed Mr. Clinton and decided he could get along with him, which is interesting, isn't it? And I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
After that barrage of Clinton foreign policy, I couldn't help but thinking how Tony Lake defined this foreign policy. He described it as pragmatic neo-Wilsonianism. That might explain why my colleagues are having some trouble finding some good points in the policy. As usual, I'll be trying to deal a little bit more with politics and economics. James Carville, who was the manager of Bill Clinton's victorious campaign last year, once said this about our president: he is a man blessed and cursed with the ability to make connections in policy terms. For Mr. Clinton, foreign and domestic policy connect to produce economic policy. Remember his campaign mantra? It's the economy, stupid. Of course, we Americans considered this a revelation. But consider this. Once when recalling Napoleon's remark to Goethe that politics is our fate, Walter Rathenau, a Weimar Germany figure, begged to differ and said, no, the economy is our fate. And indeed it is, even though international attention is focused this week on the president's diplomatic journey to Europe. This is not to disparage the importance of NATO's hesitant outreach eastward, or God knows the promise of having Ukraine cleared of its forest of intercontinental ballistic missiles. But the fate of Russia, and therefore the fate of countries on its doorstep, and therefore the peace of Europe and the world is inexorably tied to global economics. This, I believe, is something that President Clinton intuitively understands. If I'm wrong, if his belief in these connections is not real but just political chatterboxing, and he's pretty good at that, then we're in trouble. But of all the events of the President's first year of concern to this audience tonight, there were three that I think stand out, and all were of importance economically and globally. The first was passage of his bill to reduce the growth of the national debt by $500 billion over 5 years. The second was NAFTA. The third was GATT. I will discuss all three. The President's deficit reduction bill can trigger endless debate over whether it will put and keep this country on a trend line towards lower debt relative to gross national product. I will stay out of that quagmire and focus on perceptions. And the perception is that Mr. Clinton strengthened the revenue base by raising taxes without short-circuiting our slow but steady recovery. The Cassandra cries that this was going to stop the recovery have not come true. The projected deficit in fiscal 1995 is now under $200 billion as a result of a de facto freeze on discretionary spending, the cut down in defense spending that is of concern to Charles and a lot of us, and an increased tax returns as a result of this economic recovery. Entitlement spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security is still out of control, but Clinton promises to attack even that through health care reform. We shall see. What does all this mean internationally? It means that we're on an economic path for the moment that is the envy of our trading partners. Japan and Germany would kill to have our growth, unemployment, and inflation figures. No longer do we hear scoldings from Tokyo that we have to put our house in order, and that's because Japan's house is in disorder. No longer do we have to suffer Germany's assumption that its quality control and productivity are superior to ours. The reverse is true. This, I am quick to add, is not Bill Clinton's creation. Presidents pretend they control the economy when things are going well, and they blame it on someone else when things are going badly. But in fact, they're hostage to forces they can only nudge in the hope their nudge will create the perception they wish. It could as easily be argued that the current recovery is George Bush's doing. It was he who refused to prime the pump in an election year. He was content with a slow but sure recovery, accompanied by a rise in white-collar and middle management joblessness that doomed him to defeat. To that extent, Mr. Clinton is the beneficiary of George Bush's economic policies. He will not disown his inheritance, even if he won't acknowledge it. NAFTA and GATT, in contrast, were obvious leftovers from the Bush years. And these were leftovers that Mr. Clinton openly embraced and, to his credit, pushed through to completion. And for what reason? Because trade is the most visible bridge, the most visible connection between foreign and domestic policy. If commerce flourishes, jobs are created at home, and stability is enhanced beyond our borders. Trade ideally is not a zero-sum game, contrary to Ross Perot, but one nation's gain can be a gain for both nations. Trade accords are very painful politically. Inevitably, some individuals and some industries are going to be hurt. And in politics, office holders hear from the wounded, not from the winners. So Mr. Clinton had to decide to take the heat on NAFTA, and he did so despite the yammerings of Ross Perot and a revolt by labor unionists and protectionist liberals in his own party. He evidently had made the connection that NAFTA was key not only to good relations with all of Latin America, but would in the long run help the domestic U.S. economy. I was in Argentina at the time that NAFTA passed the House, and I can tell you that editors from all over the hemisphere were watching that vote, and if it had gone the other way, we would have heard a lot about it. What followed after NAFTA? NAFTA also was a warning, by the way, to Europe and Asia that if they took the route of trade wars, the Western Hemisphere could be a daunting adversary. What then followed was the event that made 1993 undeniably the year of trade. 116 nations belonging to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade ended 7 years of haggling to come to closure on reforms of the world trading system. One reason was the danger of trade wars that I just mentioned. Another, believe it or not, was that Bill Clinton convinced other national leaders that it was now or never. Unlike George Bush, he was willing to walk away from GATT if no agreement was reached last month so he could focus on health care reform. Does this mean he's indifferent about the adverse effects this would have had? I doubt it. I think basically he's an economic nationalist, as witness his use of blunt instruments in dealing with China and Japan. And perhaps he figured that if the European Union was going to balk at a GATT deal, he would use the full might of the American economy to bring his counterparts, especially the French, to their senses over time. Here again, we find Bill Clinton making connections. He does not see health care reform as a strictly domestic undertaking, but as a necessary step to curtail medical spending and thus keep the deficit somewhat under control. It's his, Mr. Carville mentioned that Mr. Clinton could be cursed as well as blessed by his tendency to make policy connections. Yes, indeed. The pitfalls could include his intellectual arrogance, and it goes throughout this entire administration. They all are quintessential policy wonks, and that divorces them, I think, from a lot of reality, including some of the realities my colleagues have mentioned. Clinton is a political animal. He likes to cut a deal, work a compromise, create win-win situations. We've seen this, I think, in the discussions tonight about NATO. This is perfect Bill Clinton. He thinks that he can work out a deal in Arkansas as a governor and building a road. Well, he can go to Europe and with a little bit of sweet talk and a little bit of trading back and forth, work out a deal. The question, though, is that he's dealing with far graver questions than roads in Arkansas. But nevertheless, I think he's made some very important progress so far as putting this country right in terms of our international economic policy. And now, under our usual arrangement, we open this to questions. I think Dr. Byrd will handle it. My only request is that we do not talk about the editorial policies of the Baltimore Sun. You can attack me later. This is a discussion on foreign policy.
Well, we thank the panel for a marvelous introduction and basis for questions. The floor is now open. Yes, sir.
How do you think President Clinton deals with the request for membership in NATO by Czech, Hungarian republics, Poland, and I've heard from the chief executive himself of Bulgaria that these countries are interested in NATO membership, and they also face the prospect of Western investment not being as eager to invest in their countries unless they have NATO members.
Since the floor was asked, the question was asked from the floor, I'll repeat it, and it was simply how would, do you think that Mr. Clinton should respond to the requests of the various Eastern European countries' requests for participation in NATO, and it was added that, of course, they're under and the variable was added that their economic recovery might be linked to membership in NATO.
Do you want me to have a go? Well, he's already responded with this murky agreement which he has got NATO to adopt, so that the Partnership for Peace blueprint, at least, is today a reality. Now, a deal has to be struck with each country that might want to get into NATO, and I think the prominent ones, the ones you would expect, would be the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland. Now, and possibly Slovenia, but it's a submission of an application is something that any country, as I understand it, including all those that used to be in the Soviet Empire, can do. But it's going to take years, and I really don't know, Joe, what I think about the diplomacy that was involved here, whether it was clever or not. It yielded to concerns that the Russians would have if we were to expand NATO toward them. It did not commit us to larger military budgets yet, but on the other hand, it held out the opportunity for these countries to say, you have promised to defend us. It's not clear to me against whom or what. I mean, I think the Poles have a pretty good idea who their foe might be. So I don't know what I think of this. What do you think, Joe?
I'll let Mark take this one. Go ahead.
I can perhaps add a little bit of information to that. We're not supposed to make judgments about policy, but try to interpret facts. But it looks as though Clinton may have gotten into a kind of lose-lose situation diplomatically on this. He adopted the policy of partnership for peace to avoid granting NATO membership to Eastern European countries as a way of preventing the Russian nationalists from getting their backs up and taking it out on Boris Yeltsin, who is Bill Clinton's, I guess, #1 foreign policy priority. There could be two results from this. One is that the Russian nationalist backs are already up and they're not going to be appeased by this. And secondly, that the Eastern Europeans are not going to be the least bit satisfied at this halfway, undefined, never admission to NATO. And as Lawrence Eagleberger told a group of us last week, it also may not be borne out by reality. If we're losing something in our relationship with the Eastern Europeans by not granting them membership, and yet when the rubber hits the road and if they are ever attacked by an outside force, Mr. Eagleberger believes that the American people and Congress and maybe even Western Europe will have learned enough from history that they won't allow Eastern Europe to be devoured, and we would be forced to defend them whether they're members of NATO or not.
A short question, but a difficult one. What's Americans' policy going to be in the Middle East in the Clinton administration in the next 3 years?
To get a comprehensive peace agreement involving Palestinians and all the Arab states neighboring Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And this is a policy that they inherited and have pursued, and so far had considerable success with. Clinton and Christopher brought in Dennis Ross, who has worked for both parties from time to time in his life, but is I guess, an original Middle East hand and a big thinker, and is very determined, and he's got the ball and he's running with it. It's been interesting that they've had, if anything, more success happen on their watch than George Bush did. Although it could be that by then there was enough momentum that the Israelis and the Palestinians picked up the ball and carried it to a conclusion themselves. It's extremely dicey, and there's an incredible amount of animosity in the Arab world as a whole toward Israel, and in Israel certainly toward the Palestinians. But so far, no amount of violent backlash has set the clock backward.
Yes, sir, at the far mic.
A new policy that I've heard Ambassador Madeleine Albright discuss, I believe she calls it global interdependence, might involve the assignment of American military units under UN Secretary General Command and the furnishing of American military intelligence accordingly. I wonder if this point of view has made many inroads in the administration, and what the reaction might be on the Hill and amongst the American public generally.
Sure. I think that the events, Mr. Shepard, I think the events of the year discouraged a lot of dreamers and idealists in the administration who came into office with a great belief in multilateral military action under the aegis of the United Nations. I think what happened both in Bosnia and Somalia created a feeling of, created a lot more realistic thinking in the administration, and I think there's been quite a lot of tension between the administration and Boutros Ghali as a result. That's my feeling. I don't think personally that the Congress is going to allow wide-scale use of American forces abroad under the command of persons who are not Americans. Charlie can mention some precedents where that has happened in the past, but that was in a much different context, I think, than we're dealing with now. So I don't think we're going to see the Congress permitting American forces to be under a lot of foreign leadership. And I think Somalia and the quick public reaction to Somalia that Mark mentioned is an indication of that.
Since Joe mentioned that I could bring up precedents, I must tell you that I sent him a message on a word processor one day saying von Steuben commanded American troops, and right back in a flash came, yes, but General Washington was his boss. So, I mean, the truth of the matter is that the NATO treaty is or the NATO military command arrangements are a prime example illustrating that the United States government hasn't the slightest intention of letting its troops come under the command of anybody other than Americans, or maybe from time to time temporary operational control or something of the sort. But the whole chain of command has an American at every important point, and I agree with Joe in spite of the aforementioned discussion.
Yes, ma'am, at the first mic.
Me? Okay.
Yes.
I'll go ahead and take it then, right? The Clinton administration appears to be acknowledging the problem of population growth, especially in developing countries, and they also appear to be addressing the consumption of natural finite resources. I'd like someone on the panel to talk to the role of population growth, consumption of natural finite resources, and socioeconomic inequalities in national, regional, international conflicts. I was disappointed that none of these were mentioned when we talked about international or about conflicts, and I think they should be addressed. Thank you.
Not my field. Repeat the question.
I'll take a stab at it. I think that this administration probably is a lot more amenable to some of the things like the Rio Conference on the environment, to international accords in dealing with the pollution of the oceans, and certainly in international accords on clean air and so on, than probably its predecessors. I think it's a more dramatic decisions where, in the case of in dealing with the whole business of population control around the world, I think this administration probably is a lot more amenable to the idea of distributing family planning devices and family planning literature around the world than the Reagan or Bush administrations. And there's a little bit of a hopeful note on that. There was a report out just a week or two ago that some of the poorer countries, the countries that we assumed in our arrogance could not possibly deal with population control at all, have actually, through education, made more strides than had been anticipated. So I would hope that this administration does become a very active player in population control and pollution and environmental activities, and I suspect that's what's happening.
Much like to thank our panel. I think it's been an extraordinary evening.